So I guess, first of all, thanks for staying for the end of the day. I know I'm standing in between you and an early finish, so I'll try and keep this moving fairly quickly as we go through. I can talk for hours on football, but I'll try not to do that today. Just, can I get a sense of who's in the room? Who follows football actively? There's a few people in the room, a few people who don't. Actually, one of the interesting things about Scotland is that there was a study done last year, and it says the number of people attending live football in Scotland is greater per head of population than anywhere else in Europe. So although our football is not very good, we like it for some reason, and we keep on going. So, for kind of full disclosure, I'm a Wraith Rovers supporter. Those of you who don't know Wraith Rovers, they're from Kirkcaldy in Fife. That's another Fife theme for the day. They're currently in the third league out of four, so just below halfway down in the sort of league structure of Scottish football. I'm told they are the least resourced full-time football club in the UK. There's no other full-time football clubs in the third tier of Scottish football or the fourth tier. So we get the players who want to be full-time that nobody else wants in Scotland. So we're not doing all that great just now. Until about 6 months ago, football was what I did in my spare time. 6 months ago, I joined Supporters Direct Scotland as their CEO. I'd been involved for the previous year on the board, just as a voluntary position. And I've got quite a long association with Supporters Direct Scotland. I've been the chair of the Wraith Supporters Trust, I think, for about 13 or 14 years. It was set up in 2001, and I joined as a member at the start, and then I joined the board about a year after that. And then somebody suggested that I become chair for a couple of years in 2004. And I still am chair now, so I haven't managed to pass that role along. My background is as a supporter activist. Supporters Direct was set up in 2001, and it was built on the work of a guy called Brian Lomax, who was a supporter activist. He's kind of recognised as the father of supporter activism in the UK. He's a Northampton Town fan, and he saw their club was in crisis in, I think, 1998, and he came up with the idea of a supporters trust. So an industrial and provident society, a legal vehicle for supporters to put their money into the football club, not as individuals, but as a collective, as a democratic organisation. So that was 98. A couple of years later, the government gave it some start-up funding to be set up as Supporters Direct. There's some numbers there on the slide there. It says 192 trusts in the UK. There's more than 40 community-owned clubs in the UK. As a result, not exclusively of the work that Supporters Direct do, but as a big part of it. And last year we set up in Scotland as an independent organisation. We'd found for quite a few years that funding sources for football supporters are kind of tied to either England and Wales or Scotland. There's not many people that will fund UK-wide sport and supporters organisations. So we set up last year separately as a community benefit society, founded on cooperative principles. That's kind of a big part of our identity. So I run that now on a part-time basis. I wear a lot of hats. So I'm in theory 1 day a week doing football stuff professionally. The last few months it's been a lot more than 1 day a week, but try and get the balance back. And my role in the Wraith Supporters Trust is purely voluntary, and it's just something I do socially, really. But we own, you'll see in the data I'm going to share a little while later, we own a significant shareholding in the football club, but that's been problematic for us. And my interest in data for football was about trying to get people motivated to do something. If we could just understand the data, understand the complexity of it, we'd know where to take action. So I'm going to wind back to, so this is, I hope this slide builds, and it probably does. So Wraith Rovers, although it's a tiny club, really, in the grand scheme of things, it's got a turnover of about £1 million a year, and it's got about 25 full-time employees. So it's probably a small to medium-sized enterprise, technically, but it's got a horrendously complex ownership structure. So Wraith Rovers Football Club it was set up, I think, in the 1920s as a limited company, and it's 76% owned by a company called Starks Park Properties Limited, and 18% held by Wraith Rovers Holdings Limited, which in turn is owned 58% by Starks Park Properties Limited, and so Starks Park Properties Limited is an effective 86% shareholder of the club. But who owns Starks Park Properties Limited? It's owned by NRR Investments Limited, which until a few years ago was registered in the British Virgin Islands. It's now no longer registered there. It's a UK company, and it's owned by one guy. He's a Kirkcaldy guy. He's a son of the manse, So he and Gordon Brown are the same age, and their fathers were ministers in Kirkcaldy when they were kids, with churches that were over the road from each other. And in 2005, the club was going through some pretty severe problems, and there was a community takeover, and this guy, John Sim, was brought in by Gordon Brown because he had a bit of money and he had the wherewithal to do something about it. So he provided a lot of the capital that allowed a takeover to happen. But he doesn't live in the UK, and at that time, in 2005, he took quite a small stake in the club, but lent a lot of money as well to secure the stadium, which is why his company is called Starks Park Properties. It's a property investment company. That's not the full picture though. So there was a holding company created back in 2005 called New Wraith Rovers Limited, which was meant to be a way of ensuring shared and stable ownership. So there's a rule written into the company structure that nobody could own more than 40% of it. And there was, I think, 6 big shareholders at the time, all of whom owned between 11% and I think 23%. So it was structured to be shared and stable ownership. And the Supporters Trust were a big part in making that happen. So we advocated for that. We said, so this is what we need to be pushing for. So we campaigned for that, for a different kind of ownership structure than a rich individual owning the club. But we find ourselves in 2018 back in a situation where a rich individual pretty much owns and controls the club. So it's an interesting story. So that's where it sits just now. That looks a lot simpler than anything that I used to say about the ownership of Wraith Rovers. So wind back to, so that's the other part of there, of total share capital is 2.8 million. Whether that's important or not is kind of up to you to decide.
So who's the rich individual owning the club just now?
It's a guy called John Sim. So he's an accountant based out in Thailand. He's CEO of an accountancy, an insolvency practice, which is kind of interesting that he gets attracted to football, which has had its fair share of insolvency events. But he's just a Wraith Rovers supporter, but who happens to be the head of an insolvency practice. He used to watch Wraith Rovers as a kid. So actually, I'm going to wind the clock back to 2006. So in the months following the last takeover in 2005, it happened, and it was announced as being a community takeover, and the club was now saved. And we'd bought a significant stake in the club at that time, so I think we owned 12 or 13% of the club through money that the ordinary supporters had raised over the course of about a year and a half. So we had a seat on the board for the first time as supporters. We had a major stake in the club. We had a voice. But out there in the real world, everybody thought the club had been saved, and it was just a new company. It was now New Wraith Rovers Limited, and everything simple. But what actually happened, it was just a holding company that sat above a previous holding company that had been created in 1990, and above the limited company that was set up probably 75, 80 years ago. And we tried to kind of explain this to people, that it's just another layer on top of this, and all that mess still exists. But people didn't really seem to get it, and every Saturday afternoon, we'd stand behind a pasting table in the stand at Wraith Rovers. People would come up, our members would come up and ask us questions about this takeover that just happened, saying, so everything's good now, everything's saved, that's right, isn't it? And we were like saying, well, things are better than they were last year, but they're still not great. And I ended up answering the same questions again and again and again, and I thought there's got to be an easier way to this. So I started writing pie charts, and I'd post them up on the wall, and people could go and have a look at them. But there's still a lot of questions about them. So I started to enhance my pie charts and add some narrative, try and tell the story about who owned what at the club, how it had got there, and what needed to happen next. So I've just printed these out. This is easier than showing it on screen. It's a double-sided A3. There's a few for that table, if you could get that to the back tables. I'll keep a copy for myself. So this is the latest version. This is the December 2017 version of this that shows who owns the company just now after the most recent takeover. And it's basically saying, so there's these 4 companies, describes who they are, who's involved in them, describes the relationship between them, and how did we get here, this timeline of 135 years of a football club's history in Scotland, and showed its changing fortunes in terms of the number of people that support it, the amount of money it makes, the amount of money it loses, its place in the league structure, and to try and get beyond the sort of simplistic questions or statements that people would make. They'll say, well, we just need to get back to the Premier Division, then everything will be okay. Because you can look back in time, times when the club was in the top division of football in Scotland, but was still a bit of a basket case off the field. So it was trying to really explain it's more complicated than that. You have to look at a number of different factors to really understand what's going on. And then you can decide what to do about it. So then the second side of this was really just looking at the modern era from about 1990 onwards, which is one of the brightest parts of our history as a club. So we won the League Cup in 1994, we got promoted to the Premier Division a couple of times, we got into Europe, got through 3 rounds of European competition before being beaten by Bayern Munich. We were beating Bayern Munich 1-0 at half-time in the Olympic Stadium in Munich. It's like everybody's got that as their screensaver on their computer if they're a Wraith Rovers fan. But even despite that, we were a year away from almost going out of business again. So the observation I made was that clubs like ours are only ever 1 or 2 decisions away from another crisis, and that can happen at any time. And we've had them in the last couple of years, because despite all of our work in raising that money, buying a stake, we got back in a bit of a mess again. So that's kind of the simple version of what we handed out to people, and that really seemed to help because it got beyond this simplistic, well, the club's saved now, we now own the club, it's now a community-owned club, to actually a bit more of a richer understanding of what the real picture was. So I've been updating that every 6 months or so for the last 12 years and publishing new versions online, sticking them up on the wall. It's got quite a lot of information in there that I managed to get the club historian on a good day, where he gave me his database of everything he knew about the club, about share ownership, but also about results and attendances. So I've got an Excel file that's got every single match Wraith Rovers have ever played, who it was against, what the score was, who played, and what the crowds were like. So I got the numbers from there, which is kind of interesting because I'm not sure where else I could have got that. And Companies House, I was able to go back and look at historical information. So who owned it 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. And that was actually the thing that really got my attention and got me, because before this was just a little bit frustrating. I'd have to answer these questions again and again and again. And I thought I'd done it and people still didn't understand. So write it down, that'll help. And it was just a way of me not being irritated by the same questions over and over again. But once I started to delve into the history, there was a really interesting story emerged about how the club came to be in the state it was in. So 10 years after this takeover, the club had stabilised, still only a couple of decisions away from crisis. And I started looking into what happened. So when did it start being a bit of a basket case? And I also got an invitation from Supporters Direct Scotland to give a presentation at their annual conference to tell the story. And I thought, okay, I better do some fact finding. And then at that event, the editor of Nutmeg magazine asked me to write an article about it, to publish that, to get that seen more widely. And just a couple of months later, the next takeover happened. So we were armed with all the information about what had happened previously. We could actually hold this up and say, well, look what's happened in the club's history. If we can design this the right way, we're more likely to get a good outcome there. So this is my presentation on who owns Wraith Rovers, why, how and when, and its evolution from 1981, where this is very typical of a small football club in Scotland at that time. It was one company, so it was one limited company. All these are individuals, and I think with exception, actually, 1981, all of those individuals lived in Fife. There was a bank, there was a butcher, a pub owner, a baker, candlestick maker probably. All those individuals are people that could be recognised, and people knew them in the local community. And they all owned a fairly small slice of the pie. A very small shareholding each, and then there was this huge area that was just others, even smaller shareholders. And then in 1981, a merchant banker from Edinburgh suggested that the club use this government scheme to basically get a bit of a tax dodge, to be able to put money into the club and offset it against tax. So it was a great idea. He was a Wraith Rovers supporter, and his idea was this is a great way of getting more money into the club to help it. If you look at the chart of league placings, I'm not sure if it's all that visible there, but in the early 1980s, we were plummeting really. It was one of the times when the league position was going pretty dramatically south. So this is an idea of saying, well, if we just had a little bit more money, we could turn this around, we could do a lot better job of running our football club. So he suggested they use that scheme. I always, this is a kind of interesting thing, the business expansion scheme to encourage investment in young growing companies. That's 2 years before our centenary. So the company was 98 years old. It wasn't growing either. And I always like to, this is my own personal politics, but I always like to pin the blame on Margaret Thatcher. and our government for any change that's made. But this was a successful way of getting more money into the club. So the share capital of the company had gone from 12,000 to 80,000 in the space of 5 years after this decision was made. And you can see the number of shareholders is smaller, so there's 6 there. Each hold a slightly bigger slice of the pie than they did in 1981, and the shares gone from 62% to 33% owned by other, even smaller shareholders. But the club had run out of money again, and it needed to do more. So, it used to be that you could get a lot of small shareholders together to act in their common interest as Wraith Rovers supporters, but now it was 6 guys in a room who really called all the shots, and they didn't need to go out and talk to anybody else. That 66% shareholding could really make any decision it wanted about how the club was run. And there's the first time there, one of the shareholders is Kingsway Entertainments, so it's a company for the first time. Previously it was all individuals. That was Kingsway Entertainments ran the bingo in Kirkcaldy, so it is a Kirkcaldy entity. I never actually found out who it was that owned it. So it changed quite a lot in 6 years. But again, I say the club was running out of money again. And by the early 90s, total share capital was still 80,000 because there was a cap on the number of shares that could be issued. So no more money could come into the club. It was capped out. And there was 3 of these historic shareholders that didn't want any more shares to be issued and said, well, no, that's enough. We don't want any more money coming in. And they're the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. They blocked this. And one of a local businessman who's actually still invests in the club, he had money to burn. He's a house builder, and there was property being built, and he had a bit of spare cash. Wanted to put it into the club. Was desperate to do so to get more of a share of the action there, and was frustrated by this. Someone spotted that you could just have an extraordinary general meeting, and you wouldn't need 75% people to agree to anything. You just need 50 plus 1%. If they swept up all those small shareholders and a couple of the bigger shareholders, they'd have to 51%. And they were able to create a new company. So Wraith Rovers Holdings Limited, 1994. This is the year that we won the League Cup. I'll never stop going on about that. But this new holding company was created there that really shared this 50.01% of the company. And it was, that company itself was 85% owned by Alex Penman, the house builder. So he now, for the first time in the club's history, he could call the shots. He owned 85% of the company that owned 50.01% of the company that owned the football club. So he was in control. And it coincided with our best period on the pitch. So we're up in the Premier Division. We stayed up for the first time round, so we had 2 seasons there before getting relegated. But we won the Europe, as I say, the League Cup, and got into Europe. And it was fantastic. And then the hunger was to do it again, to get back into the Premier Division. So they tried it again. We got back up to the Premier Division, but wages started spiralling out of control. We started signing players for hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it was starting to spiral downwards. And in the early 2000s, Nicholas Anelka, who those of you who follow football will recognise him, France international, played for Arsenal. His brother's a nightclub DJ, or was at the time, and also his agent. He went around Scottish football clubs saying, "I've got some money. Will you let me be coach?" And because he'd been a very promising footballer when he was younger. He'd been apparently better than his brother, but had a bad knee injury as a teenager, so stopped playing. But still fancied himself as having a career in football. So he said, if I just get somebody to accept my money, I can get involved in football. And Wraith Rovers were one club that didn't say no. So he came in, bunch of money, brought in, I think he signed 12 players one summer, one of whom had played 11-a-side football before. The rest of them were signed from the Paris 7-a-side league. I was one of the Scottish youth players that was at the club at the time. I talked to him a few years ago, and he said the first training session was hilarious because it was 24 boys up to the park, literally jumpers for goalposts. There was 24 of them, so they played 12 a side because that was just in the local park with anybody watching. So it was farcical. Claude Anelka lasted 10 games as manager. We drew one of them, and that was when he brought in a guy who used to manage Chelsea as assistant manager. And he did the team talk that day, and we got a draw away at Airdrie. And then he left 2 days later because he didn't want Claude Anelka meddling in the plan anymore. So it was an interesting time for Wraith Rovers supporters. 10 years passed, and this the ownership situation continued. It was still, this holding company. It changed hands. The The house builder had got out. We have, if I can work has this got a pointer thingy on it? There. West City Developments there. That company there owns 58% of the holding company at that time. That was a way of trying to spin the stadium off, separate the stadium ownerships from the football club's ownership. Because the idea was that banks would lend to a property development company, but they wouldn't lend to an insolvent football club, which is possibly true. But the ownership of that company had changed again. It was three guys, Danny Smith, Colin McGowan, Alex Short, from the West Coast. They're kind of colloquially known as the gangsters. I don't think they're really gangsters. Well, actually, one of them was. I'm not telling you which one. One of them's still involved in football. He owns Hamilton, and he was involved at Airdrie. And if you know Airdrie, there's a lot of dodgy things going on there. But they're still one of them is still involved in football. But they were there. They owned this 58% of the holding company, and they applied for planning permission to build houses on Starks Park. So Starks Park, the main stand was designed by Archibald Leach. So it really should be a historical monument. It should be a listed building. It's unsuitable as a football stand, but it's a beautiful structure. But despite that heritage, they wanted to make some changes there. So we didn't like that idea too much. So this is around the time when the Supporters Trust started at Wraith to try and campaign against this idea. And in 2004, we launched Reclaim the Rovers, which was an attempt to get all the local community together behind a bid to really save the club. So that's when New Faces came in. We couldn't raise enough money in the time that we had. So at the end, the takeover was underfunded. So the only way we could do it was to create another holding company around the outside. So we're now gone from, in 2006, to having a new holding company, New Wraith Rovers Limited. And this is the one where we built in these safeguards that says nobody can own more than 40%. And we had 5 shareholders, and some others, none of whom owned more than 22.5% of the club. So that gave the supporters our stake in the club, got us a seat on the board, and we thought, well, at least we're in the room when all these decisions are being made in the future. So we felt like it had been a success, even though that the job wasn't complete, and we thought, well, just give us a few more years and we'll raise a bit more money and we'll tidy things up. We'll tidy this company structure up, we'll get more money into it, we'll fix the things that we couldn't fix when we're in crisis mode. But we weren't able to do that. 2006, I think we were still in the second tier of Scottish football, what's now the Championship, but we got relegated after that, and it continued being pretty horrific. And then 10 years passed, and then this is the slide that I really showed before, so I don't need to step through that in a lot of detail, but, sorry, go back one step though. If I can. So the interesting one on here is that intercompany loans between New Wraith Rovers Limited and all these other companies, they meant that it wasn't really the shares that you had to pay attention to, it was all the money that was owed between the companies and how much people had put in as soft loans. So we went through a process, the club went through a process of tidying all that up and converting those loans into shares and really moved the power out of those sections in the middle, and it really was, New Wraith Rovers was the only real show in town. So John Sim, actually at that point in time, Mario Kyra, a local hotelier, he owned 29%. Turnbull Hutton, I think was a former executive at Diageo, he owned 21%, both guys from Fife originally. So they, between them, owned 50% of that company, which was enough to really keep control. But they were both in their 70s, wanted out. They stopped wanting to put their pension into Wraith Rovers and keep on funding the losses every year. So there was an opportunity for them to get out, get some of their money back, or at least stop losing more money. And we'd been relegated again. So we'd made a couple of these crisis decisions that really put the club in hot water. So we were in a pretty horrible state off the pitch and on the pitch. And I'd continued just updating these charts at this time. But then out of the blue, we got an email or a phone call one day saying that there was a takeover bid coming from this guy, John Sim, the son of the manse, who'd been involved for about 12 years, but not really actively involved. And he was going to buy out all the shareholders. And we thought, well, he's probably been around long enough that we can trust him. But the way he wanted to do that was by not simplifying the structure, but adding another layer onto it. So another holding company. So Starks Parks Properties Limited got the shares, and it all converted around there. So the dark purple sections is what John Sim controls. So he pretty much called all the shots at that time. And yeah, that's kind of where we are today. It's not changed since then. And our challenge over that 12 years is really trying to help people get behind the simple headlines that people say about football. And we can see it at other clubs as well. You get announcement that there's been an ownership change or there's been a community buyout. And really what there is there's a 5-year plan to do that. But in the meantime, the club's still vulnerable. So I'd been doing this work on Wraith Rovers, and it helped the conversation between the supporters at Wraith Rovers, although ultimately didn't stop ownership changes from happening. We just didn't have enough influence to do that. But at least we felt that we understood it a little bit better. Then I got the request to present this at the Supporters Direct conference, and then Andrew Jenkin, who was my predecessor at the Supporters Direct Scotland, he said, "Can you do that for the other 41 clubs?" And stupidly I said yes. Now, by this time it was pure curiosity, and I thought, yeah, they won't all be as complicated as Wraith Rovers. I'll do that. So it was a case of going onto Companies House website. Again, this is just in my spare time. Going onto the Companies House website, finding annual returns, some of which had been handwritten, scanned in, faxed to Companies House and uploaded, and then trying to decipher them all, and all that kind of stuff. So I got pretty good at finding raw data that was very, very raw. And actually, what Clive was saying earlier about raw sewage was probably more of an accurate description of it some of the time. But I kind of found that, and I'll skip that one. We published Who Owns Scottish Football. So I presented, and this first one, the slides don't quite work here, but I've got an online version that we can look into. But the idea was to create this was done in PowerPoint with lots of weird animations that you can click a button at the bottom and different badges pop up, and you can say, so which ones are minority supporter owned? You click that button and a bunch of them pop up. And then you click one of the badges and it goes to that club. I think I maybe picked one. Oh, there. So wholly supporter owned. One club in Scotland was Clyde FC at that point in time. And you click you do another one and it builds like that, and you can see lots of other stuff. It doesn't quite work there. But we also said, it's not just about ownership, because ownership is one thing, but there's other things that are probably more important. So how well do the club engage with their supporters? So there's a bit of work that Supporters Direct have been involved with the government, with the SFA, the SPFL and some others, that was saying, so what does best practice look like around supporter engagement? What does best practice look like on transparency? So we came up with these 7 tick boxes. So a supporter representative, an elected representative on the board of directors, you get a tick for that one. If you appoint a supporter liaison officer, and that's a particular role on a match day, somebody who goes and just is there as a point of contact for supporters, and almost the conduit between the supporters and the police, the stewards, the club, anybody else. Somebody who can talk for the home fans with somebody who can talk for the away fans, and they can coordinate things, and even as simple as where to park your bus or which pub to go to before the game, that kind of stuff. And a process of structured dialogue with supporters was another one we mentioned. And then transparency. So what do the club actually like to share about how they do business? And this is the one that really interested me a lot, because Scottish football, probably football anywhere, is a very secretive industry. People don't really like sharing what goes on. So my idea, and the idea behind a lot of people who are sort of involved in supporter activism, is that you compete on the field, but off the field you collaborate and you try and improve the game for everyone. So if the whole game's doing well, every club within it will be doing well. And sometimes you'll have a bad season, you'll get relegated. Other times you'll get promoted, but it won't be a crisis anymore. But that's not a view that's shared by a lot of people running football clubs. But we said, so what are the 4 things that we could look for in terms of transparency? So did they publish their accounts, or at least headline financial data on their website? Do they list who their directors are? Do they provide details of who owns the club, the ultimate beneficial owner, on their own website? And do they publish the number of board meetings held and the directors attending? So it's quite frightening. We're not really asking for a lot of information there, but no club gets 7 out of 7. There's no club at all in Scotland that publishes the number of board meetings held and the directors who attend. So you don't know who actually makes the decision. A lot of clubs don't even say who their directors are. When we did and I might dig into the data if we've got a bit of time, but probably not. When we did this work in 2017 about do we know who owns every club in Scotland, there was one club that we didn't know the owner of. It's Dumbarton Football Club. So at that time, they're a part-time club. At that time, I think they were in the third league, so it's called League One, confusingly. But they're a part-time club, more than halfway down the football structure, and they were owned by a company that was registered in Belize. And nobody knew who the owners of that company were. And nobody knew why it was a secret. Speculation that it was they wanted to own the land because it might be valuable for houses, but we don't really know. I had a conversation with the Wraith Rovers owner one time, the guy who used to own his shares through the British Virgin Islands company, and I said, so why would owners want to do that at Dumbarton? He says they just don't want their phone to be ringing off the hook on a Saturday night after they've been beaten. He says it's as simple as that. I don't think that's entirely true, but it might be true. And obviously higher up in Scottish football, Rangers have had a lot of negative press about their ownership situation. That's a bit of an understatement. And there's a big question about who owns Rangers. There was an ownership change about 2 weeks ago, and if you watch Companies House close enough and you have alerts set up and it tells you when any change is made, I got a document that was registered on Companies House and then pulled 15 minutes later, which I think shows who really owns Rangers just now. But I'm not sure of it, so I don't want to make it too public just now until I do a bit of fact checking. But you get some pretty interesting information, because 15 minutes later it was a different story, completely different story that was announced to the press. So that even basic transparency is difficult to find. And I used the same sort of dynamic for that, and I won't skip through all these in detail. But this is just an example of one slide that I showed about a football club. So it was the first one in the alphabet. There's nothing else that was significant about my choice of Aberdeen when I decided to show this. So they don't have an elected representative on the board, but they've got an SLO. They do structured dialogue, although their supporters trust saying they don't really. They say they do, but they don't really. They publish their financial data. They publish their director's identity, but not the ownership. So in the accounts, you can't find out who owns that. And they don't publish details of their board meetings. So that was kind of quite a typical example. And it turns out at the end of all that work, researching 42 clubs, Wraith Rovers has got the most complicated structure in Scottish football, still does to this day. So thankfully it wasn't 42 times that amount of work that I had to do for the first one. So it was relatively quick. But once I'd done that for the first time, and I was asked to do that as a bit of a one-off, and I didn't think it would take as long as it did, so I agreed to do it. I probably would have said no if I'd known. But after I'd done it once, I thought I can probably keep this up to date if I just simplified the process. And this PowerPoint thing with pie charts embedded and animations and builds, anytime one of the 42 clubs published their annual return, and data changed, I had to go and rebuild it all. So I thought, I've got to get away from doing that. So my top tip for doing anything like this is don't use Excel and PowerPoint. I found a program called Tableau, which is a pretty phenomenal piece of software that does all of this stuff a lot better than Excel does. So I kind of moved to Tableau, and when I get an alert from Companies House that says something's changed at that club, I can go and check the numbers, and 5 minutes later, a new version of it is published online. Anybody can go online, read it, click into this. It's fairly user-friendly. It looks a lot better than my nasty slides did way back when. It's almost real time. I've got 2 clubs to check this evening because I've been on holiday for the last week, but it's about as real time as you can get. So it's about simplifying the process and getting better presentation software. So Tableau, it's just great for visualization. You can do a lot more. I've now actually forgotten how to use Excel for charts because I just use Tableau the whole time. I'm going to see, so that's kind of what it looks like. If I can click this should load to the web page, and you can see what else is in there. Yeah, I guess the Wi-Fi must be just too slow, or the website's blocked or something like that. But it's an online resource anybody can go to. You find it straight away there. It kind of makes sense. It's hopefully easy to navigate and much easier to understand than these nested pie charts, which were pretty horrific to read as well as to create. Oh, there we go. It's finally loaded. So I've got this table at the front that says, so who owns Scottish football? Here's which ones are wholly supporter owned, which ones are majority supporter owned, and the interesting one this season. I think, yeah, so this is the first time a club in the Premiership has been majority supporter owned. Motherwell are, I think it's 76% supporter owned and run now. But we've also got Hearts and St Mirren, which are there and there, which have got a structured takeover process with the current owner, so that within the next 2 years, I think it's summer 2020, Hearts will be supporter owned. And within the next 8 years, St Mirren will be supporter-owned. So 3 out of the 12 clubs in the Premiership are there. So it feels like a bit of a landmark moment for supporter activism, supporter ownership in Scottish football, and something we're quite proud of. There's been a lot of progress, further down the leagues as well, with more clubs getting, more supporters getting a stake in their club. The other thing that I did with this is that you can then go and look at each club. And if this loads, so we can see, so in the Premiership, which clubs have got the biggest supporter shareholding, who owns Aberdeen, who owns Celtic, who owns Dundee, the local one. And again, this is one that's a bit of an unknown. So it says, so Football Partners Scotland are the biggest shareholder in Dundee, and you have to dig quite deep to find out who that is. But we just put the names up there, and then people don't have to dig as deep. They don't have to get bewildered by Companies House and do that. The Rangers one is interesting, so I keep on having to update this part of the website there. So yeah, and on 21st of August, the Rangers filed notification that it was a change of ownership. That's the one that, for 15 minutes looked like it was something quite different than what was publicly made available after that. So it's a bit of an ongoing challenge to keep up to date, to keep on researching, keep our eyes on what's really going on in Scottish football. Then the other thing, the last thing I want to do, and I promise this will be my last bit before I let you all go home. So I did another project, and this was the database that I got from the club historian about attendance figures. So football fans are weird. We're obsessed by how many people were in the stadium on a Saturday. So at the end of, I don't know if it's every club in Scotland, but it's every football match I go to, 5 minutes before the end, they say, today's crowd is 1,832, 1832, thank you, and everybody claps. It's like, do they do that at the cinema? Just when the film ends, does somebody come over the tannoy and say how many people were there? I have no idea what it is. And there's a pretty obscene word that people use for this competitive nature of boasting how big your crowd is compared to everyone else, which I'll not use today. But I thought, now that I've got this data, can I do something with it? And I actually just wanted a bit more practice with Tableau. So I thought, if I chuck all this data into Tableau, what will happen? What will it look like? So I published. And I've been keeping it a secret. I've not really told many people about this, that I've done this, because it's pretty embarrassing that I would go to this length of detail. So I chucked it all in there, and it says average home league attendance per season, color-coded by what division we were in, match by match. I've not put Saturday's attendance figure in there, but we can have a little look at that. And then I looked at my favorite one here. I found a new kind of chart. So this was home versus away league attendances. So we have twice as many people watch us if we play Rangers at Ibrox than they do at Starks Park over our entire history. But also what I like most about this is you can pick out who your rivals are. So the blue and the orange circles are kind of overlapping there. Dunfermline Athletic, almost overlapping at Falkirk, Ayr United, almost overlapping there. So you can say, so that's actually who we should be competing with. And all those teams are in a higher division than us just now. So it's a bit of a motivating factor. As I say, football fans are weirdly competitive about stuff that shouldn't actually matter that much. But this is kind of my way of doing this. And I kind of gathered this, and once I'd started it, I thought, I've got to keep this going. So every Saturday night, I get home from the match, and I look up Tableau, and I get my spreadsheet open, and I type in the number for that day, and upload it, and it's live, and it's in real time, and I'm all proud of myself for 5 minutes, and then deeply, deeply ashamed. But I also wanted to do this as a bit of a demonstration to people that if something's important to you, you can find the data, it's there. It might be difficult, it may take time to get it in place the first time, but then once you've done the hard work once, you just need to keep it going, and it's actually good. And if that's so important to people that they want to know about that, that's kind of what you can do with it. I like making charts like that with kind of orange and blue dots and stuff like that. So actually, orange and blue are not colours that you should use in Scottish football, because they both refer to Rangers, and people think I'm a Rangers fan because I used orange and blue. If I'd used green, and they would have said I was a Celtic fan. You can't win.
What are Rovers colours then?
Blue, dark blue.
Do you not use that?
I could have done. So one of the other one I've got is I think it's this tab, or is it? No, it's the next current season's opponents. And you can find all sorts of weird ways of presenting data there. So I just use the badges on a kind of histogram. Scatter plot chart there. Then down the bottom, I found this weird thing. I don't really understand what it is, but it says when we play Airdrie, when we played them on that date, that was the attendance. If I can find the wee thingy that pops up, there's somewhere on there it tells you what the average was, or what these different points in the bar chart mean. Oh, there we go. The upper whiskers and the upper hinge and the median and the lower hinge and the lower whiskers. I have no idea what that means, but I just thought it looked cool. So So it's all there. I mean, anybody who wants to explore that could do that. And if anybody was foolish enough to try and find all the attendance figures for their own club, I could just give them the template and they can dump it in and they can do whatever they want with it. So it's kind of the stuff that I've done, partly because I'm just a bit of a geek and I was just curious. And somebody asked me a question one time and I felt the need to answer it. To devote countless hours of my life to answering a question that didn't really need to be answered. So that's kind of what I've done with data around there. A couple of tips that I had was that, actually it's more important what the story is that you're wanting to tell. So you find out what's important. So if it's ownership and if it's about the vulnerability to another takeover, or how did we get in this mess over the last 35 years when we seem to be, a very typical sort of kind of small town club in Scotland, it's there and you can find out that data, find out the story. You work out the data first and then you fill in the gaps with data later. I could have done that with 3 slides and I could have just found like 1981, 1994 and 2017 and it would have been just as good. I found more data just so I could add some more nuance into it, but actually the data was less important than the story and what it's actually going to motivate you to take action on was my takeaway. So kind of my slides done. Any questions?